On November 10, 1898, Alexander Manly watched armed men destroy his newspaper press while city officials he had helped elect were forced from office, removed by those sworn to uphold the law, and replaced without a single public vote or protest. Alexander Manly was the editor of the Daily Record, Wilmington's black-owned newspaper, when a legally elected multiracial government was violently overthrown on November 10, 1898. The act was not spontaneous, it was organized. Alfred Moore Waddell and leaders of the white supremacy democratic movement publicly demanded the resignation of city officials and then enforced it. The evidence is not hidden. Contemporary newspapers, sworn statements, and municipal records confirm that elected officials were removed and replaced without an election. This film will show how that transfer of power occurred in full daylight, without federal intervention, without immediate prosecution, and without the word coup entering official language for more than a century. By the autumn of 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina, was not an unstable frontier town. It was the state's largest city, a commercial port with a significant black majority, and a functioning multiracial government formed through a fusionist alliance between Republicans and populists. Black citizens voted, black officials held municipal positions, black entrepreneurs operated businesses in the city's commercial district. That reality by itself was politically explosive in the post-Reconstruction South. The election cycle of 1898 unfolded under mounting racial tension. Democratic Party leaders in North Carolina openly campaigned on restoring white political control. Newspapers sympathetic to their cause published warnings about Negro rule. Public speeches escalated in tone. Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and prominent political figure, declared in October 1898 that white citizens would choke the Cape Fear River with carcasses before accepting black political authority. These words were not metaphor, they were preparation. On November 9, 1898, the day after Democrats regained control of the state legislature, a document known as the White Declaration of Independence was drafted and circulated in Wilmington. It demanded the removal of black political influence and the exile of Alexander Manly from the city. The next morning, armed men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. The printing press was destroyed. Manly fled. Violence spread across the city. By afternoon, elected officials were compelled to resign under threat, and Waddell was installed as mayor. No statewide election authorized this transfer of authority. No court validated it. It happened because a coordinated political movement decided it would happen. The immediate damage is measurable. Businesses in the black commercial district were burned or abandoned. An unknown number of black residents were killed. Hundreds fled Wilmington permanently. Within days, the city's government bore no resemblance to the one voters had selected. Within 2 years, constitutional amendments in North Carolina imposed literacy tests and poll taxes that effectively disenfranchised black citizens across the state. Yet for decades, official accounts described November 10, 1898, as a race riot. The term suggests chaos. It implies mutual disorder. It obscures sequence. A riot is spontaneous. A coup is deliberate. The distinction matters because it determines whether democracy failed accidentally or was removed intentionally. In the months following the insurrection, national attention shifted. The Spanish-American War dominated headlines. Economic expansion resumed. Wilmington's events receded from front pages. There was no sustained federal investigation. No criminal prosecutions followed. The absence of formal reckoning allowed language to harden into narrative. Narrative hardened into memory. Reputation in the Gilded Age and progressive era was currency. Public figures who framed themselves as restoring order were often protected by the same press networks that amplified their message. Alfred Moore Waddell would later serve as mayor for years. The city stabilized under new leadership. Stability, however, is not proof of legitimacy. It is proof of consolidation. What remains unsettled is not whether violence occurred. That is documented. The question is how a government could be removed so openly and then absorbed into the legal structure of the state without reversal. How did a forced resignation become administrative continuity? How did organized political violence become textbook terminology? If you are willing to examine the documents that survived and the language that concealed them, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls. And if this investigation resonates intellectually, let the record show it. Because on November 10, 1898, the damage was not rhetorical. It was physical, administrative, and immediate. A press was destroyed. A government was replaced. A city changed hands. The next artifact in this story is not a speech, it is a written demand, signed and dated, and it was never meant to be read as evidence. On November 9, 1898, a document was drafted in Wilmington, North Carolina, under a title that was neither subtle nor spontaneous. It called itself the White Declaration of Independence. It did not describe chaos, it did not respond to violence. It demanded it. The text survives in the state archives of North Carolina, preserved among municipal and private papers that were never meant to function as confession, but now read as one. The declaration was written the day before armed men marched on the office of the Daily Record. It was composed before the printing press of Alexander Manly was destroyed. It preceded the forced resignation of elected officials. The sequence is not contested. The document exists. The date is printed on its face, November 9th, 1898. Its language is administrative, not emotional. It declares that the Negroes of Wilmington had overstepped their place. It asserts that white citizens will no longer be ruled by a multiracial government. It demands the immediate removal of what it describes as intolerable conditions. It calls specifically for the exile of Alexander Manly, editor of the Daily Record, whose editorial criticizing white supremacy had circulated weeks earlier. It demands the end of black political participation in the city's governance. The document was signed by prominent white leaders, businessmen, lawyers, and political figures aligned with Alfred Moore Waddell and the Democratic Party organization that had campaigned throughout 1898 on restoring white control. These were not anonymous agitators. These were individuals embedded in Wilmington's economic and social hierarchy. Their signatures converted rhetoric into instruction. The declaration did more than complain. It declared intent. It declared that the existing government would be removed. It declared that black citizens would be excluded from political authority. It declared that resistance would be met with force. The document did not ask for negotiation. It declared terms. The following morning, November 10, 1898, those terms were enforced. The presence of the document alters the frame entirely. A riot is disorder without design. A coup is design made visible. On November 9th, the design was written down. In the archives, the document is catalogued without theatrical emphasis. It sits within collections labeled by donor name and box number. Its paper bears no scorch marks. Its ink has not faded into obscurity. It survived because it was never classified as incriminating. For decades, historians described Wilmington as the site of a race riot. School textbooks repeated the term. Public commemorations echoed it. The written declaration complicates that language. If the violence of November 10th had erupted without warning, the word riot might suffice. But on November 9th, the White Declaration of Independence declared that elected officials would be removed. On November 10th, they were. The consequence is measurable. The existence of the Declaration provides written proof of premeditation. It establishes that the overthrow of Wilmington's multiracial government was not an impulsive reaction to street conflict, but a coordinated political action prepared in advance. That proof reclassifies the event. It reframes legal responsibility. It reassigns moral weight. Alexander Manly was named directly. His expulsion was not collateral, it was specified. Within 24 hours he fled the city under threat. His printing press was destroyed. His newspaper ceased publication. The Declaration did not merely criticize him, it removed him from civic life. The city's mayor and board of aldermen were similarly targeted. Though their names do not dominate the Declaration's text, the demand for immediate resignation was implicit in its call to end Negro domination. By the afternoon of November 10th, under armed pressure, those officials were forced to resign. Alfred Moore Waddell was installed as mayor without a municipal election. The Declaration therefore functions as a bridge between speech and seizure. It is the hinge between campaign rhetoric and administrative replacement. Why, then, did the word riot persist? The answer may lie in who controlled narrative infrastructure. Newspapers sympathetic to Democratic leadership framed the events as necessary correction. Official reports avoided the language of insurrection. Federal authorities did not initiate prosecutions. The absence of legal challenge allowed the terminology to calcify. The Declaration was never hidden in a vault sealed by court order. It was never erased from paper. Instead, its significance was minimized. It was treated as political theater rather than operational blueprint. That minimization became institutional memory. The document survival in the North Carolina archives creates a quiet contradiction. It records intent clearly. It precedes violence chronologically. It names targets explicitly. It outlines demands concretely. And yet, for generations, public discourse softened its implications. The act of drafting the Declaration on November 9, 1898, was itself an exercise of power. It declared authority to redefine the city's government without electoral consent. It declared legitimacy for removing black leadership. It declared that white signatories would determine political boundaries. The immediate consequence was displacement. The longer consequence was disenfranchisement. Within 2 years, constitutional amendments in North Carolina imposed literacy tests and poll taxes that effectively restricted black voting statewide. The Declaration did not enact those laws directly, but it demonstrated that removal of political opposition could occur without federal intervention. The paper remains. Its language is precise. Its date is unambiguous. Its signatures are legible. If a coup is written down in advance and the writing survives, the question is no longer whether it happened. The question becomes why it was described differently for so long. The Declaration does not explain the gunfire that followed. It does not detail the number of citizens killed. It does not record the businesses destroyed. It does not enumerate the families who left Wilmington permanently. It outlines intention. The rest was execution, and the fact that the intention was recorded one day before the execution removes the possibility of spontaneity. The archive box closes without protest. The folder slides back into place. The date, November 9th, 1898, remains visible in black ink. The next step is not in the archive. It is in the room where the decision was finalized. In the 1898 election cycle, Wilmington, North Carolina did not represent disorder. It represented arithmetic. According to the 1890 federal census, black citizens comprised a majority of the city's population. By 1898, that demographic reality translated into ballots cast in visible numbers. Black men voted. They voted in coordination with the Fusionist Party, an alliance between Republicans and populists that had, since 1894, broken the Democratic Party's monopoly over state and local offices. The danger was not chaos in the streets. It was legitimacy at the polls. The Fusionist coalition had already demonstrated its capacity to win. In 1896, statewide offices in North Carolina were secured through that alliance, and by the time the 1898 municipal elections approached, Wilmington stood as one of the most symbolically potent examples of interracial governance in the post-Reconstruction South. Black aldermen served on the city council. Black policemen were employed. Public offices were not exclusively white. Representation was imperfect and contested, but it was real. This is the context in which the White Declaration of Independence was drafted on November 9, 1898. It was not reacting to lawlessness. It was reacting to lawful political participation. The Fusionist Party did not seize control through violence. It accumulated votes. Black citizens cast ballots in sufficient numbers to influence outcomes. White populists, often small farmers resentful of economic elites, joined with black Republicans to defeat Democratic candidates who had once governed unchallenged. The electoral process was documented, tabulated, certified. That certification created exposure. For white Democratic leadership, including Alfred Moore Waddell, the sight of black political authority in Wilmington was not a temporary inconvenience. It was an existential contradiction to the narrative that had taken hold across the South after Reconstruction. The prevailing argument among white supremacist Democrats was that black political participation had been an aberration imposed by federal occupation. By the late 1890s, federal troops were gone. The Compromise of 1877 had withdrawn direct federal enforcement from southern states, and yet, in Wilmington, black citizens continued to vote and hold office under state law. That continuity was the threat. In October 1898, Democratic newspapers in North Carolina amplified speeches and editorials warning of Negro domination. The rhetoric was deliberate. It reframed democratic representation as humiliation. The presence of black office holders was cast not as civic engagement but as disorder. The term fusion itself was weaponized as contamination rather than coalition. The risk, from the perspective of democratic leadership, was not instability. It was precedent. If Wilmington's interracial government remained intact through the November 1898 elections, it would serve as proof that multiracial democracy in the South could function without federal supervision. That proof would undermine the central justification for restoring white-only political control. It would weaken the ideological foundation of what would soon become Jim Crow law. Black voting in Wilmington during the 1898 election cycle therefore carried consequences beyond municipal boundaries. It threatened statewide momentum. It threatened fundraising networks. It threatened the narrative presented to national observers. The national press was watching. Newspapers in New York and Chicago reported on North Carolina's political tensions. The contest between Fusionists and Democrats was framed as a test of Southern governance in the post-Reconstruction era. Wilmington was not invisible. The Democratic Party did not lack organization. Throughout 1898, white supremacy clubs were formed across North Carolina. Parades were organized. Campaign literature circulated. Speakers, including Alfred Moore Waddell, delivered addresses arguing that white citizens must reclaim control. These were not clandestine meetings. They were public rallies. They were coordinated political efforts. designed to shift power before ballots were counted. The act of black citizens voting in significant numbers was therefore treated not as civic participation, but as defiance. In this climate, legitimacy itself became dangerous. When black aldermen exercised authority on the Wilmington City Council, they did so under statutes that had not been repealed. When black voters supported fusionist candidates, they did so under election laws that remained in effect. The Democratic leadership did not challenge those laws through court petitions. They did not seek judicial injunction. Instead, they reframed participation as threat. The concrete action of power during this period was not yet removal, it was declaration. Alfred Moore Waddell and allied Democratic leaders publicly declared that white control would be restored, regardless of electoral outcome. The language preceded the act. The consequence of that declaration was escalation. Armed groups were mobilized. Political discourse shifted from persuasion to ultimatum. The consequence for black citizens was exposure. Their lawful participation placed them in identifiable roles: voters, office holders, editors, businessmen. Visibility made them targets. Alexander Manly's editorial in the Daily Record in August 1898 criticized white supremacist narratives surrounding interracial relationships. The response was swift and sustained. His words were cited repeatedly by Democratic speakers as evidence of insult and provocation. By November, his name appeared in the White Declaration of Independence as someone who must be expelled. The electoral cycle of 1898 thus created a paradox. The more effectively black citizens exercised the franchise, the more their participation was described as illegitimate. Democratic leaders argued that white supremacy was necessary for order, yet the order they opposed was produced through lawful voting. The threat was not violence, it was governance that did not center them. On November 10, 1898, when armed men forced the resignation of Wilmington's elected officials and Alfred Moore Waddell assumed the office of mayor without a municipal vote, that action did not correct disorder. It reversed electoral outcomes. The political control that Democrats had lost at the ballot box was reclaimed by force. The risk in 1898 was therefore ideological and structural. If the fusionist coalition could continue, it would normalize multiracial governance in a major southern port city. It would weaken the argument that black political participation inherently produced instability. It would expose the claim of white supremacy as preference rather than necessity. That exposure could not be permitted. The danger was not riot. The danger was representation. The archives record voting returns. They record office holders' names. They record speeches delivered in campaign halls. They record the census showing demographic majority. None of these documents describe chaos prior to November 10th. They describe participation. Participation became the pretext, and in a city where ballots had altered control, those who had lost control did not wait for the next election. The polling places closed, the votes were counted, the arithmetic stood, and in that arithmetic lay the motive that would soon move from speech to decision. In early November 1898, before a single municipal office had been formally vacated, the question in Wilmington was no longer who had won the election. The ballots had already been cast. The fusionist government still stood. The question had shifted to whether the result would be permitted to stand. The answer did not emerge in a courtroom or a legislative chamber. It emerged in a series of private meetings among local Democratic leaders, where the language of contest gave way to the language of removal. By November 7th, 1898, Alfred Moore Waddell was no longer speaking as a defeated candidate. He was speaking as a man prepared to assume authority by other means. Contemporary newspaper reports and later testimony confirmed that gatherings were held among white Democratic leadership in Wilmington during the days immediately preceding November 10th. These were not spontaneous assemblies of aggrieved voters. They were organized consultations among men with property, influence, and access to armed supporters. The decision that crystallized in those rooms was not ambiguous. The municipal election results would not be accepted if they preserved black political influence. That was the line. Waddell had already positioned himself publicly. In speeches delivered in late October and early November 1898, he declared that white citizens must regain control of Wilmington. The rhetoric was explicit. If the ballot failed to deliver supremacy, other measures would. The phrase was not framed as rebellion, it was framed as correction. On November 9, 1898, the day the White Declaration of Independence was adopted, the document did more than condemn Alexander Manly. It demanded the resignation of the existing city government. It did not petition. It declared. It asserted that white men would no longer tolerate Negro rule, and it required compliance under threat. That language constituted an informal authorization. In administrative terms, no statute empowered Waddell to remove a mayor or disband a council. No court order was sought. Instead, a parallel authority was constructed through public declaration and private coordination. Armed, white citizens were instructed to be ready. Rifle clubs, already organized during the campaign season, were mobilized. The shift was procedural. Control moved from electoral certification to force capacity. On the evening of November 9, 1898, following the publication of the Declaration, Waddell addressed a crowd of white supporters. Multiple sources record his statement that if the existing government did not resign, it would be removed. The verb mattered. It was not metaphorical. It was operational. The consequence of that speech was immediate mobilization. White men gathered in coordinated formations. Weapons were visible. Leadership was identifiable. This was not an unstructured riot. It was command language followed by compliance. Early November 1898 marks the point at which intervention ceased to be hypothetical. The decision had been made. The electoral outcome would not determine municipal authority. The following morning, November 10, 1898, events unfolded in sequence. Armed groups marched first to the offices of the Daily Record, destroying Alexander Manly's printing press. That action carried symbolic and tactical significance. The removal of a newspaper editor neutralized dissent and demonstrated capacity. But the more decisive action followed. A delegation accompanied by armed men proceeded to the City Hall. There, elected officials were presented with a demand for resignation. The language was formal. The setting was coercive. The officials were not charged with crimes. They were not impeached. They were told to step down. Under threat of violence, the mayor and members of the Board of Aldermen resigned their offices. The act was not recorded as a vote. It was recorded as a forced compliance. Waddell then declared that he would assume the office of mayor. This was the decisive intervention. The concrete action of power was the removal of duly elected officials without legal process. The consequence was the immediate transfer of municipal authority to Alfred Moore Waddell and his appointed allies. No election followed. No referendum was held. The offices were filled by white Democrats selected by those who had orchestrated the removal. Control had passed from the ballot to the rifle. The paramilitary presence ensured there would be no counterclaim. Black citizens who might have resisted had already begun to flee the city. Others remained under threat. An unknown number were killed in violence that accompanied the seizure of power. The exact figure was never formally established, a fact that would later contribute to the reframing of events. What distinguishes this moment is not its brutality alone, it is its clarity of intention. The intervention was not improvised in response to disorder. It was premeditated in response to electoral arithmetic, the private meetings, the drafting of a declaration, the public speech by Waddell, the mobilization of armed men. Each element preceded the formal displacement of government. In legal terms, the sitting officials had been certified. In practical terms, they were removed. The Democratic leadership did not conceal its intention in the immediate aftermath. Newspapers sympathetic to the cause described the event as a restoration of order. The term revolution was used approvingly in some accounts. The language was not defensive. It was declarative. Yet over time, that vocabulary would narrow. The decision to intervene in early November 1898 created a rupture. It established that electoral outcomes could be overridden by coordinated force if the demographic composition of voters threatened established hierarchies. It also created a problem: how to describe the act without conceding illegitimacy. At the moment of decision, that concern was secondary. The priority was control. Waddell's declaration that he would assume the government was not symbolic theatre, it was executed. His authority was recognized by those with weapons and by those who controlled local institutions. Once installed, he reassigned positions, filled vacancies, and consolidated influence. The institutional machinery adapted quickly to the new arrangement. The city continued to function. Ordinances were passed. Offices were staffed, taxes were collected, administration resumed. The speed of normalization obscured the violence of transition, but the hinge remains early November 1898. That is when the line was crossed from contest to intervention. That is when the decision was made that ballots would not be allowed to stand if they contradicted supremacy. The record preserves the speeches. It preserves the declaration. It preserves the date. What it cannot fully capture is the moment when a room of men chose not to wait for law. And once that choice was made, the next act was not debate. It was alteration. Between November 10th and November 12th, 1898, inside Wilmington City Hall, the violence of the street was translated into the language of record. The rifles did not appear in the minutes. The smoke from the burned press did not stain the paper. What remained was ink, and ink, when controlled, can make force look procedural. On November 10th, 1898, after elected officials were compelled to resign under threat, the municipal ledger was opened. The clerk recorded departures. The phrasing was restrained. It did not describe armed men waiting outside. It did not describe the conditions under which signatures were obtained. It simply noted that certain offices were vacated. The action was administrative. The consequence was structural. Wilmington City Hall altered its own memory in real time. The resignations were entered into the official minutes as though voluntary. That alteration mattered. By framing the removals as resignations rather than coercion, the record shielded the event from immediate legal challenge. No impeachment was recorded, no indictment was filed. The government was said to have changed hands through resignation, not expulsion. Alfred Moore Waddell was then declared mayor within the same institutional framework. His name was entered as successor. The act of declaration carried the weight of legitimacy once it was inscribed. The page did not reflect the conditions under which that authority had been assumed. It reflected only that it had. On November 11th, 1898, additional positions were reassigned. City council seats were filled by white Democrats aligned with Waddell. The previous office holders, men who had been elected during the 1898 election cycle, were removed from the official roll. Their names no longer appeared in the active registry. The action was recorded as appointment. The consequence was the consolidation of municipal authority under a single political faction without election. Public employees followed. Black policemen and municipal workers who had held positions under the fusionist administration were removed or reassigned. Their absence was not always accompanied by formal charges. In some cases, positions were described as reorganized. In others, access to duties was restricted until replacement occurred. The administrative language was neutral. The effect was targeted. By November 12, 1898, the structure of Wilmington's government had been materially altered. The mayor's office, the board of aldermen, and key municipal posts were occupied by men selected by those who had orchestrated the takeover. No public vote ratified these changes. No judicial review reversed them. The world had shifted, and the shift was recorded as order. The minutes of Wilmington City Hall from those days survive. In them, one sees the mechanical process by which an elected government was rewritten. Entries were adjusted. New officers were sworn in. Committees were reconstituted. The ledger does not record panic, it records compliance. That is the alteration. The physical space of City Hall did not change location. The walls remained, the desks remained, but the occupants did. And in municipal governance, occupancy is power. The consequence was immediate and enduring. Wilmington's municipal authority was restructured without constitutional amendment. The city was officially reclassified under new leadership through entries in a book. The Constitution of the United States was not rewritten. It did not need to be. The alteration occurred at the municipal level, beneath the threshold of national intervention. How do you erase a government without rewriting the Constitution? The answer, preserved in those November pages, is by rewriting the minutes. The removal of black officials and the installation of white Democratic appointees altered not only personnel, but policy direction. Within weeks, administrative priorities shifted. Public appointments reflected racial exclusion. Decision-making was consolidated. The fusionist experiment, an alliance between black Republicans and white populists, was administratively dismantled. No referendum recorded. Dissent. The power exercised was concrete. Officials were removed, positions reassigned, names altered in the registry. The consequence was institutional, the collapse of a multiracial municipal government and its replacement by a regime aligned with white supremacy. And once the record reflected the new order, challenges became more difficult. A lawsuit would have had to argue that the resignations were invalid. But the page did not say coercion. It said resignation. The language insulated the act. Even newspapers sympathetic to the Democratic leadership referred to the event as restoration. The word coup did not appear in official municipal documentation. The alteration of terminology had begun. The restructured government continued to function. Ordinances were passed. Budgets were approved. Taxation continued. From an administrative standpoint, continuity had been preserved. From a democratic standpoint, representation had been extinguished. The removal of Alexander Manly's printing press silenced a voice. The alteration of City Hall silenced a vote. The broader consequence unfolded over months and years. The successful reorganization of Wilmington without federal intervention signaled that local authority could be reshaped through coordinated force and then stabilized through documentation. Other jurisdictions observed. The lesson extended beyond one city. But inside Wilmington City Hall, the immediate transformation was procedural. Signatures replaced signatures. Names replaced names. The ledger absorbed the rupture. It is important to note that no constitutional crisis was declared in Washington. November 1898 did not produce a national inquiry into municipal displacement. The alteration remained local, and therefore survivable within the broader system. The federal framework remained intact. The local framework was rewritten. The injustice endured not because it lacked witnesses, but because it was successfully converted into paperwork. The elected officials who had been forced to resign did not reappear in the official registry. Their absence was administrative, not theatrical. It was not accompanied by ceremony. It was accompanied by ink. By November 12, 1898, Wilmington City Hall presented a coherent facade of authority. The city's official seal authenticated documents issued by men who had not been chosen by the electorate days earlier. The transition appeared complete. What had changed was not only who governed, it was how governance could be altered without national disruption. The alteration did not require constitutional amendment. It required control of a building and the power to record. And once the record was set, it began to generate its own legitimacy. The minutes from those days close with routine entries, committee assignments, procedural notes, confirmations. There is no notation that a government had been erased. There is only evidence that one had been replaced. The ink dried. The city seal was pressed into paper, and the previous order existed only in memory, no longer in the book. By 1899, the Democratic Party leadership in North Carolina no longer treated Wilmington as an isolated correction. It treated it as confirmation. What had been accomplished on November 10, 1898, through rifles, forced resignations, and rewritten minutes, was now consolidated at the state level. The beneficiaries were not obscure. They were organized, named, and positioned. Alfred Moore Waddell did not retreat into ambiguity. In 1899, he formally occupied the office of Mayor of Wilmington, declared legitimate within the municipal record that had been altered days after the coup. His authority was not provisional. It was sustained. The Democratic Party leadership of North Carolina consolidated its control, not only in Wilmington, but across the state apparatus, using the momentum of the crisis to reshape electoral law itself. The action of power was concrete. In 1899, Democratic legislators began drafting what would become the 1900 Amendment to the North Carolina Constitution. The language was framed as reform. It was declared necessary to secure electoral integrity. It was introduced as modernization. But its function was specific. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and procedural barriers were designed to restrict the franchise. Access to the ballot was formally restricted. On August 2, 1900, the amendment was ratified by statewide vote. The consequence was immediate and measurable. Black voter registration collapsed. Political participation among African Americans, which had been significant during the 1898 election cycle under the Fusionist coalition, was reduced to a fraction. The Democratic representation that had once existed in Wilmington was no longer statistically viable. The Democratic Party leadership in North Carolina had moved from reactive force to structural entrenchment. The beneficiaries were clear. By restricting the electorate, the Democratic Party eliminated meaningful opposition at the ballot box. Political competition narrowed. Office holders aligned with white supremacy remained in power for decades. The institutional architecture that had been threatened in 1898 stabilized under single-party dominance. The action, restricting voting rights, produced a consequence that extended beyond Wilmington. It reshaped state governance. The injustice presented at the outset, the destruction of Alexander Manly's press, and the removal of a legally elected multiracial government did not dissipate, it was formalized. The 1900 Amendment did not mention Wilmington by name. It did not reference Alfred Moore Waddell's speech in early November 1898. It did not cite the White Declaration of Independence, yet it functioned as their legislative continuation. What had been enforced with armed men was now enforced with examination forms and tax receipts. The Democratic Party leadership declared the amendment a defense of civilization. That declaration masked its selective effect. Literacy tests were administered with discretion, poll taxes accumulated financial barriers, registrars possessed authority to interpret compliance. The law did not explicitly name race, its implementation did. The consequence was not abstract, it was electoral silence. Between 1898 and the early 20th century, black representation in North Carolina's political institutions diminished to near absence. Offices once held by black citizens were not merely lost in a single municipal crisis. They were rendered unreachable through constitutional design. The beneficiary was a party. The cost was a constituency. In 1899 and 1900, the Democratic Party leadership of North Carolina consolidated control in a manner that would persist until the mid-20th century. Legislative committees were chaired by Democrats without effective opposition. Judicial appointments reflected partisan alignment. Public policy was shaped within a narrowed electorate. The action had been decisive. The consequence was durable. Political power stabilized, markets adjusted, municipal budgets functioned. Newspapers gradually ceased describing Wilmington as a coup. The event was reframed as correction, then as restoration. By the time the amendment took effect, the immediate violence of November 10, 1898, had receded into narrative distance. What remained was governance under a single party. The beneficiaries did not need to speak openly of advantage. The advantage was embedded in the numbers. By 1904, voter rolls reflected the impact of the restrictions. Black participation was effectively excluded from competitive influence. White Democratic candidates ran with diminished opposition. The political volatility that had characterized the fusionist years subsided. The Democratic Party leadership in North Carolina had transformed an episode of political violence into a foundation for systemic control. This consolidation did not occur in secrecy. The legislative debates were public. The ratification vote was public. The language of reform was published. Yet the chain connecting November 10, 1898 to August 2, 1900 was rarely articulated within official discourse. The beneficiaries did not describe themselves as inheritors of a coup. They described themselves as restorers of order. The injustice, however, did not vanish because it was legalized. The removal of black political leadership in Wilmington had produced a vacuum. The 1900 amendment ensured that vacuum would not be reversed by electoral means. That is the consolidation. Power once taken by force was secured by statute. The consequence extended beyond ballots. Economic opportunity tracked political representation. Contracts, public employment, and civic influence followed the new distribution of authority. The beneficiaries were not solely office holders. They were networks aligned with the party that now faced limited opposition. By 1899, the question was no longer who controlled Wilmington. It was who controlled North Carolina. And by 1900, the answer was stabilized. The Democratic Party leadership did not need to repeat the events of November 10th in every town. The precedent had been set, and the franchise had been restricted. The mechanism of exclusion moved from rifles to registration desks. The beneficiaries were organized. The excluded were dispersed. Political power, once volatile, became predictable. And predictability is itself a form of strength. The record from those years does not contain confessions. It contains legislation. It contains ratification tallies. It contains statements of constitutional amendment. But within that administrative clarity lies the measurable outcome, A multiracial political experiment was replaced by one-party dominance. The injustice at Wilmington was not an aberration that failed, it was an operation that succeeded. And in 1899, the Democratic Party leadership of North Carolina stood as the direct beneficiary of that success. Their authority reinforced not only by occupation of office, but by the narrowing of the electorate itself. The ink that once erased names in Wilmington City Hall now inscribed new rules for an entire state. The consequence was decades long. And in the legislative record of 1900, the transformation appears not as upheaval, but as amendment. By 1899, what disappeared in Wilmington was not only office holders or ballot access, it was geography. The black commercial district that had once stood near the Chute, Cape Fear River, dense with barber shops, grocery stores, insurance offices, churches, and the press of the Daily Record, no longer functioned as a coherent civic space. Storefronts were shuttered, signage was removed, properties were abandoned or transferred under pressure. What had existed as an economic corridor was reduced to scattered parcels under new names. The disappearance did not occur in a single announcement. It unfolded between 1899 and 1905 through deeds, vacancies, and silence. County records in New Hanover County show properties reassigned, some sold below market value, others transferred after owners fled. Titles were altered, occupancy changed hands. The action was administrative, but the consequence was demographic. Hundreds of black families left Wilmington in the months following November 10, 1898, and many did not return. On November 10, 1898, Alexander Manly had already fled the city under threat. By early 1899, he had relocated north, effectively exiled from the community he had helped shape. His printing press had been destroyed, his building burned, but what followed was broader than one man's displacement. The Daily Record's absence left a vacuum in public speech. No black-owned newspaper replaced it in Wilmington for years. The editorial voice that had once challenged racial narratives was removed, and the consequence was informational silence. Businesses that depended on black patronage or leadership closed in succession. Insurance agencies dissolved. Professional offices stood vacant. Church attendance declined as congregants dispersed. Some families moved to Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. Others relocated within North Carolina, seeking towns less hostile or less visible. The exodus was not recorded as forced migration in official language. It appeared as relocation. By 1900, census data reflected a measurable shift. Wilmington's black population decreased relative to previous projections. The economic ecosystem that had sustained black political participation during the fusionist years contracted. The disappearance was cumulative. In 1902, municipal planning documents referenced redevelopment without naming displacement. Blocks once identified by black proprietorship were redescribed by lot numbers and revised street designations. Names were omitted from civic directories. The absence of former leaders was treated as fact, not loss. The action of erasure was visible in smaller ways. Meeting minutes from Wilmington City Hall after 1899 no longer included black council members because those members had been removed. Public rosters no longer listed certain clerks because those positions were reassigned. The consequence was institutional memory narrowed to a single perspective. Records of fatalities from November 10, 1898 remained ambiguous. Contemporary reports varied. Some newspapers minimized the number of deaths, describing the event as a race disturbance. No comprehensive accounting was preserved in official municipal archives. The omission carried weight. The absence of documented numbers became a feature of the narrative. Between 1899 and 1905, the phrase Wilmington race riot gained traction in regional press. It replaced language of coup or overthrow. It reframed targeted political violence as spontaneous disorder. The black commercial district's destruction was recast as collateral chaos rather than structured removal. The shift in terminology had consequence. It shaped how future generations would encounter the event. Alexander Manly's name receded from local reference. The Daily Record building was not reconstructed. No municipal plaque marked the location during those years. The space where his press once operated became an address without context. The disappearance extended beyond storefronts. Leadership networks dissolved. Elected black officials who had been forced to resign did not reappear in Wilmington politics. Some were listed in directories under new occupations in other cities. Others vanished from public documentation entirely. The administrative removal of their authority was followed by social removal from collective memory. Property maps from 1905 show altered ownership patterns in the former black commercial district. Parcels were consolidated, titles were reassigned. The action, transfer of property, produced a consequence. Capital accumulation shifted. The city's economic narrative moved forward without acknowledging rupture. Tourism brochures in the early 20th century described Wilmington's resilience. Business directories emphasized stability. The absence of the black commercial corridor was not described as loss, but as evolution. Memory itself was modified. By the time regional histories were compiled in the 1910s, references to 1898 often framed it as necessary correction. The term insurrection appeared less frequently than riot. The choice of language carried institutional authority. Between 1899 and 1905, what disappeared was a model of multiracial governance supported by a functioning economic base. What replaced it was uniformity. The disappearance was not solely demographic, it was structural. The black commercial district of Wilmington had once signified economic independence, intertwined with political participation. Its removal ensured that future political participation would lack that foundation. The consequence extended beyond municipal boundaries. The act of disappearance did not require continuous violence. It required consolidation and narrative control. Properties transferred, families relocated, records minimized. By 1905, a visitor walking through central Wilmington would encounter storefronts under new ownership, offices bearing different names, and no visible trace of the Daily Record's press. The physical landscape had been adjusted. The archival landscape had been curated. The injustice introduced on November 10, 1898, did not remain static. It reshaped space. It reduced numbers. It altered ownership, and in the municipal archive, what remains from those years is less a record of loss than a sequence of reassignments. An address, once known for printed resistance, became a blank line in a directory. A district once defined by black enterprise became a map without annotation, and in the silence of those changed blocks, absence itself became evidence. In the early 20th century, the language hardened. What had been recorded in affidavits, resignation, letters, and property transfers was reclassified in print. By 1901, official summaries circulating through North Carolina state reports described the events of November 10, 1898, not as an overthrow, not as an insurrection, but as a race riot. The North Carolina state reports declared the disturbance spontaneous. That single administrative choice, declared in ink and distributed through institutional channels, reversed the narrative burden. The consequence was not merely semantic. It reassigned moral weight. The term appeared consistently. Riot. It suggested chaos without leadership. It implied agitation without design. It removed authorship. The inversion was precise. If the event was a riot, then there was no architect. If there was no architect, then there was no accountability. Yet the same historical period preserved contradictory facts. On November 10, 1898, elected officials had been forced to resign under threat. Replacement names were entered into Wilmington City Hall. Records. Administrative control shifted without an election. If the event was spontaneous disorder, why did the municipal ledger reflect structured succession? The language did not align with the paperwork. The North Carolina state reports omitted formal charges against Alfred Moore Waddell. No indictment was filed against the men who had organized, marched, and occupied. No state prosecution followed. The legal system did not declare the removal of government unlawful. Instead, silence functioned as endorsement. By 1906, regional educational materials referenced Wilmington as an example of racial unrest rather than political seizure. The classification traveled from legislative reports to textbooks. The action, labeling the event a riot, produced a consequence. Victims were reframed as participants in disorder. Black citizens who had voted in the 1898 election cycle were positioned indirectly as contributors to instability. The detail that does not align is structural. Riots do not typically produce formal administrative replacement of elected officials. Riots do not conclude with newly appointed mayors assuming office through orderly minutes. Riots do not result in constitutional amendments passed 2 years later in 1900 to restrict suffrage. Yet in this case, the official word erased intentionality while the outcome reflected design. In the North Carolina Legislative Archive, the phrasing was consistent. The disturbance was described as regrettable but necessary. Order restored, authority reclaimed. No explicit recognition of a coup, no acknowledgement that a legally elected multiracial government had been removed by force. The absence of prosecution is another misalignment. If violence had been indiscriminate, if lives were lost without coordination, why were no white leaders tried? No grand jury returned an indictment against Waddell or his associates. No conviction appears in the judicial record for orchestrating the displacement of officials. The legal silence functioned as confirmation of legitimacy. The choice of terminology became durable. Newspapers beyond North Carolina adopted the phrase Wilmington Race Riot. National circulation normalized the framing. By the 1910s, the description was embedded in public memory. It did not require repetition of the facts. It required repetition of the word. This inversion had consequence beyond reputation. The term riot suggested symmetry. It implied two sides equally responsible for violence. That symmetry diluted the targeted nature of the attack on Alexander Manly and the fusionist office holders. It obscured the fact that resignation letters had been coerced. It softened the forced exile of families into generalized unrest. Language operates as administrative architecture. When the North Carolina state reports declared the event a riot, they altered the interpretive framework for decades. The consequence was historical deflection. The structural removal of a government was folded into the category of civil disturbance. Consider the inconsistency. If the event was a riot, then the Democratic Party leadership in North Carolina assumed office by coincidence rather than plan. If it was disorder, then the literacy tests and poll taxes enacted through the 1900 constitutional amendment were reactive rather than opportunistic. The word riot absorbs intention. It absorbs authorship. The classification also protected economic alliances. Acknowledging a coup would have implicated state actors in unlawful overthrow. Calling it a riot preserved reputations and stabilized political continuity. The reputational shield mattered. Wilmington was a port city. North Carolina's leadership sought national credibility. The word chosen insulated the state from scrutiny. Why does the word chosen matter more than the violence itself? Because once codified, it defines the lens through which future inquiry proceeds. Researchers consulting early 20th century reports encountered the label before they encountered the evidence. The sequence shaped interpretation. The discrepancy remains visible in municipal documentation. Replacement officials were sworn in, city governance continued under new names. The structural transfer of authority is undeniable. Yet the label persisted. By 1920, commemorative histories of North Carolina referenced Wilmington as a turbulent episode resolved through restored order. The victim's displacement was summarized. The destroyed press was mentioned briefly, if at all. The semantic inversion endured. The injustice introduced on November 10, 1898, was compounded not only by removal, but by reframing. The violence altered lives. The word altered memory. In the bound volumes of state reports, the ink is steady. The phrase is repeated, the classification is clear, and beside the official label, race riot, the resignation letters remain, dated and signed, filed in Wilmington City Hall. Between 1898 and 1901, the silence did not end in Wilmington. It traveled to Washington. In the congressional climate of 1899, as Reconstruction's last federal protections had long since eroded, the U.S. Congress did not open a formal inquiry into the events of November 10, 1898. No committee was appointed to examine the forced resignation of elected officials. No federal prosecutor was reassigned to investigate whether constitutional rights had been violated. The institution that possessed the authority to intervene declared nothing. The consequence was not procedural delay, it was precedent. If the removal of Wilmington's government had been formally classified as a coup rather than a riot, the implications would have extended beyond North Carolina. Under federal law in 1898, the denial of voting rights or the overthrow of lawful governance could have triggered congressional hearings. The enforcement acts of the Reconstruction era had provided mechanisms, imperfect, inconsistently applied, but mechanisms nonetheless. By 1899, those tools were politically dormant. The U.S. Congress chose not to revive them. That decision was concrete. It did not require a speech. It required inaction. In 1900, as North Carolina advanced its constitutional amendment imposing literacy tests and poll taxes, Congress did not restrict the change. The amendment passed at the state level and effectively disenfranchised black voters across North Carolina. The absence of federal intervention allowed the new regime to consolidate without external challenge. The consequence was institutional validation. Had Congress classified Wilmington as an organized insurrection, federal investigation could have altered alliances within the Democratic Party leadership nationally. Southern representatives relied on stability to maintain committee power and legislative influence. Public acknowledgement of a coup might have destabilized that balance. It could have invited scrutiny into coordinated efforts across state lines. It might have required testimony under oath. Financial markets in the South were also implicated. In 1898, Wilmington was a port city integrated into regional trade networks. Public federal condemnation could have introduced uncertainty into credit relationships and investment patterns. Stability in governance signaled stability in commerce. Silence preserved that signal. By declining to intervene, Congress preserved economic continuity at the cost of accountability. The inaction created a durable pattern. If a municipal government could be forcibly replaced and reclassified as disorder without federal consequence, other states could observe the result. The precedent was administrative rather than declarative. It demonstrated that the removal of black political leadership, if framed as restoration of order, would not trigger national sanction. The U.S. Congress had the authority to investigate. It did not. That non-decision functioned as an action. It removed the possibility of federal correction. It declared by omission that state-level restructuring under racial pretext would remain internal. By 1901, national attention had shifted. Industrial expansion, imperial ventures, and financial consolidation occupied legislative debate. Wilmington receded from federal discourse. The absence of hearings hardened into narrative closure. No official congressional record labeled the event an overthrow. The terminology of riot remained undisturbed. The impact of that silence is measurable. North Carolina's 1900 amendment remained in force for decades. Black voter registration plummeted. Representation disappeared from legislative roles. Had Congress intervened between 1898 and 1901, the amendment's passage might have encountered constitutional challenge at the federal level. Instead, the new framework solidified. The silence also shielded reputations beyond Wilmington. National party leaders avoided direct association with paramilitary mobilization. Southern delegations retained influence within congressional committees. No investigation meant no formal record of complicity at the federal tier. The injustice against Alexander Manly and the displaced officials remained localized. The structural implications did not. Congress's non-intervention signaled to state actors that federal oversight had retreated. That signal had consequence across the South. This was not a single decision recorded in a vote tally. It was a series of absences. No subpoena issued, no inquiry declared, no federal indictment pursued. Authority was neither reassigned nor restricted. It simply remained inactive. If Wilmington had come to light as a coup, the political vocabulary of the era might have shifted. Instead, the label of riot persisted, and with it, the narrative of spontaneity. Federal silence stabilized that vocabulary. The precedent is visible in subsequent legislative behavior. Disenfranchisement measures proliferated in southern states without immediate congressional obstruction. The path had been demonstrated. The injustice that began with the destruction of the daily record was sustained by omission at the national level. Congress did not intervene. The consequence was institutional endurance. In the congressional record volumes from 1899 to 1901, debates unfold on tariffs, expansion, and monetary policy. Wilmington does not dominate the pages. The absence itself is an entry. By January 1900, as North Carolina prepared to ratify its constitutional amendment imposing literacy tests and poll taxes, the absence of federal scrutiny had already altered the balance of risk. The U.S. Congress did not issue a formal warning, did not request documentation from Wilmington City Hall, did not reassign any federal marshal to examine whether the 14th or 15th Amendments had been effectively nullified. That restraint was a choice. It signaled that the restructuring of political participation in a former Reconstruction state would remain a state matter. The amendment itself was concrete. Drafted in 1899 and ratified by voters in August 1900, it inserted new qualifications into the state constitution that disproportionately disqualified black citizens from the ballot. The Democratic Party leadership in North Carolina declared the measure necessary to ensure good government. The language was administrative. The consequence was structural exclusion. Had Congress declared the events of November 10, 1898, a coordinated overthrow, rather than civil unrest, the legal posture of that amendment might have been different. A federal inquiry could have reframed the suffrage restrictions as an extension of unlawful removal rather than legitimate reform. Instead, the amendment was treated as a sovereign exercise of state authority. Federal silence preserved its legitimacy. This restraint had national resonance. In 1898, the United States was engaged in the Spanish-American War and its aftermath. Congressional attention was oriented toward imperial expansion and tariff policy. In that climate, reopening Southern racial conflict risked fracturing fragile political coalitions. Southern Democratic representatives held influence in committee assignments and legislative bargaining. A formal investigation into Wilmington could have destabilized those alliances. The institutional cost was deemed too high. Financial interests were not abstract. By 1900, Southern railroads, port facilities, and agricultural exports depended on investor confidence. Public acknowledgement that a municipal government had been forcibly replaced could have raised questions about contractual stability and property rights. The market did not react because the market was not formally alerted. Silence functioned as reassurance. There was also reputational calculus. If Congress had convened hearings and declared that an elected government had been removed under threat, it would have required sworn testimony. Names would have entered federal transcripts. Alfred Moore Waddell and other local leaders might have been called to account before a national audience. That did not occur. The absence of testimony preserved ambiguity. The consequence extended beyond North Carolina. Other southern states observed the outcome. Between 1898 and 1902, several states revised constitutions to include mechanisms that curtailed black suffrage. The model was procedural rather than rhetorical. Consolidate power locally, codify new restrictions, rely on federal non-intervention. Wilmington demonstrated the viability of that sequence. In practical terms, no federal court invalidated the North Carolina Amendment in the immediate years following its adoption. The U.S. Congress neither restricted nor altered the state's redefinition of the electorate. Authority remained localized. The precedent of impunity hardened. This extension of silence also shaped historical memory. Without federal documentation labeling the event an insurrection, later, historians consulting congressional archives encountered little direct reference. The absence of a national investigation limited the archival footprint. What was not entered into federal record acquired the appearance of lesser significance. The injustice that began with the destruction of the daily record and the forced resignation of city officials therefore acquired a secondary layer. It was not only that a government had been removed, it was that the removal had been permitted to stand. Without national adjudication, the effect was normalization through omission. By 1901, the immediate shock of Wilmington had receded from national headlines. No congressional committee reopened the question. No federal statute was amended in response. The chain of power remained uninterrupted. In the bound volumes of the congressional record from 1900, pages turn without reference to the municipal transfer that occurred in Wilmington 2 years earlier. The federal government neither restricted nor reassigned authority in response, and so the precedent settled quietly into the architecture of American governance, unchallenged, unrecorded in federal indictment, preserved by the space where intervention might have been. By 1905, the language had settled into curriculum. In revised civics and state history, textbooks adopted within the North Carolina education system, the events of November 10, 1898 were described not as an overthrow, but as a race riot, followed by the restoration of order. The phrasing was deliberate. The North Carolina education system approved the text for classroom use. That approval was an action of power. It declared the interpretation authoritative. The consequence was generational. In the early 1900s, school boards reassigned responsibility for historical interpretation to state-approved materials. Teachers were instructed to follow standardized outlines. The word riot appeared in lesson summaries. The removal of elected officials was reduced to a brief reference, framed as the collapse of unstable governance. No mention was made of the forced resignation letters entered into Wilmington City Hall records on November 10, 1898. No explanation was provided for the absence of prosecution. Administrative terms softened the event. Restoration of order. Necessary correction. Maintenance of stability. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were institutional descriptors. Once inserted into textbooks, they carried the authority of instruction. Students memorized them. Examinations repeated them. Silence moved from legislative record into classroom routine. By 1908, state educational circulars classified archival documents related to Wilmington under categories such as local disturbances and municipal reorganization. The records were not destroyed, they were restricted. Filed under maintenance of historical order, they became inaccessible to casual inquiry. The action was bureaucratic, not theatrical. The consequence was durable opacity. This is how normalization functions. It does not deny the event outright. It reframes it as an exception. Wilmington was presented as an unfortunate but isolated eruption, not as precedent. The removal of a multiracial government was contextualized as response rather than design. That framing protected the broader legislative agenda unfolding in North Carolina after 1900. White supremacy did not need to be named explicitly in curriculum. It had already been institutionalized. Through the constitutional amendment ratified in 1900, literacy tests and poll taxes remained in force. Voter rolls reflected their effect. By the time students encountered Wilmington in textbooks, the political transformation it enabled had already stabilized. The North Carolina education system did not debate the terminology publicly. It adopted it. That adoption was an administrative declaration. It removed ambiguity for the next generation. The consequence was historical conditioning. Citizens educated under this framework inherited an interpretation in which violence had been mutual and corrective. The treatment of the black commercial district in Wilmington followed the same pattern. Early 20th century educational materials omitted detailed references to property transfer or forced exile between 1899 and 1905. The disappearance of businesses was not categorized as displacement. It was absorbed into economic transition. The removal of Alexander Manly from public life was rarely mentioned. Institutional language also migrated into archival practice. By 1910, county record offices classified related documents under municipal maintenance files rather than political conflict. The act of classification is an exercise of power. It restricts interpretive pathways. The consequence is structural forgetfulness. The extraordinary became procedural. Teachers taught it as sequence. Administrators approved it as policy. Students recorded it as fact. The event ceased to require explanation. It required memorization. In public commemorations during the early 1900s, Wilmington's transformation was referenced as a turning point towards civic stability. The narrative emphasized economic recovery and political unity. The forced resignation of elected officials was rarely revisited. The educational system reinforced that framing annually. Normalization also protected reputations retroactively. By embedding the word riot in state instruction, the education system shielded Alfred Moore Waddell from association with unlawful overthrow in the minds of future voters. He was remembered as a stabilizing mayor rather than an orchestrator of removal. That reframing had consequence for historical judgment. This was not a single moment of concealment. It was repetition. Each classroom that recited the state-approved account contributed to institutional reinforcement. Each archived file, labeled under neutral categories, extended the duration of silence. The injustice introduced on November 10, 1898, did not disappear. It was reorganized within language. The North Carolina education system declared through curriculum that the event fit within the pattern of civil unrest rather than constitutional rupture. The declaration shaped memory. By 1915, a student studying North Carolina history could graduate without encountering the word coup in connection with Wilmington. The administrative choice had become generational inheritance. In the bound spines of early 20th century textbooks, the page describing 1898 ends with the phrase "order restored," printed in firm type, without annotation. By 1912, the pattern had matured beyond textbooks. State-sponsored commemorative publications issued through the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction referenced Wilmington in condensed timelines, placing the events of November 10, 1898, between agricultural statistics and infrastructure developments. The placement itself was administrative. It repositioned the removal of a government as a transitional footnote rather than a rupture. The consequence was contextual minimization. Teacher training institutes in the early 1910s circulated standardized outlines for history instruction. Within those outlines, Wilmington was summarized in language emphasizing political realignment. The outline did not instruct educators to discuss forced resignation letters or the destruction of the daily record press. It directed them to frame the event as part of post-Reconstruction turbulence. That directive was an action of authority. It restricted the scope of discussion. The consequence was interpretive narrowing. State archives reinforced the pattern. By 1915, requests to access certain municipal files related to 1898 required formal written petitions. The records were not sealed publicly, but they were reassigned into categories labeled restricted administrative correspondence. The reassignment was procedural. It limited exposure. Researchers encountered barriers before they encountered evidence. The normalization extended into civic ceremonies. Annual municipal addresses in Wilmington during the 1910s emphasized commercial growth and maritime prosperity. The phrase "restoration of order" appeared in speeches commemorating civic progress. No formal resolution acknowledged the forced displacement of black office holders. Public silence operated alongside educational framing. Together, they solidified a version of continuity. Legislatively, the institutionalization of white supremacy through the 1900 constitutional amendment remained unchallenged. Literacy tests and poll taxes were administered routinely. Election officials implemented them as standard procedure. The normalization of exclusion did not require overt rhetoric. It required repetition. Each election cycle confirmed the new baseline. The consequence was political permanence. In 1916, a revised state history text referenced Wilmington as a moment that clarified governance structures. The verb clarified implied necessity. It implied correction. That textual choice transformed coercion into adjustment. Students reading that sentence encountered a description that removed intent from the actors and recast the outcome as administrative refinement. This is how silence became infrastructure. It was embedded in training manuals, in archival classification systems, in legislative maintenance, and in ceremonial language. No single declaration codified the reinterpretation. It emerged through consistent procedural choice. The North Carolina education system did not issue a decree banning alternative descriptions. It did not need to. By approving one interpretation and omitting others, it declared the boundary of acceptable memory. That boundary had consequence for public discourse. Journalists, referencing Wilmington in the 1920s, often echoed the established phrasing. The institutional vocabulary migrated outward. The effect on historical accountability was cumulative. When later generations sought to reassess the events of 1898, they encountered decades of administrative reinforcement. The absence of federal intervention between 1898 and 1901 had allowed the state to define the narrative. The education system then preserved it. In this extension of routine, the injustice against Alexander Manly and the displaced officials was no longer contested publicly. It was backgrounded. The extraordinary act of removing an elected government was categorized as an episode of disorder resolved by leadership. That categorization was repeated until it acquired the weight of consensus. By the early 1920s, the narrative had achieved stability. Wilmington appeared in official histories as an instructive moment rather than a constitutional breach. The state did not retract the language. It continued to reproduce it. The consequence was a durable distortion. Normalization does not announce itself. It appears in printed margins, in filing codes, in lesson plans approved without debate. It is visible in the absence of alternative terminology. In the storage stacks of a state archive building, municipal records from 1898 sit under headings that suggest routine governance, their spines aligned, their labels unremarkable. On December 13, 2006, more than a century after November 10, 1898, the state of North Carolina did something it had refused to do for generations. It officially altered the language. The Wilmington Race Riot Commission released its final report and declared that what occurred in Wilmington was not a spontaneous riot, but a coup d'état. That phrase was not rhetorical. It was a formal reclassification, and it carried consequence. The entity responsible for this shift, the Wilmington Race Riot Commission, created by the North Carolina General Assembly in 2000, had spent 6 years reviewing archived municipal minutes, contemporary newspaper accounts, property records, and sworn testimony from descendants. The commission did not speculate, it documented. In its 2006 report, it explicitly stated that duly elected officials were removed under threat of violence and replaced without legal election. That sentence reversed more than terminology. It reversed hierarchy. It reassigned agency from mob disorder to organized political action. The action of power in 2006 was declarative. The state acknowledged that the 1898 event had been an insurrection orchestrated by white supremacist leadership, including Alfred Moore Waddell. The report named the destruction of Alexander Manly's Daily Record press as deliberate. It confirmed that black political representation had been forcibly displaced. This was not an academic correction. It was an institutional admission. But recognition is not restoration. The Commission's findings carried moral weight, but limited structural remedy. While the report recommended educational reforms and economic development initiatives for affected communities, it did not mandate direct financial reparations. It did not reverse property transfers executed between 1899 and 1905. It did not invalidate the constitutional amendments of 1900 that had restricted black suffrage for decades. The consequence was partial closure. The narrative was corrected. The architecture of loss remained intact. The contradiction is visible in public space. In Wilmington today, markers acknowledge the 1898 insurrection. Museums reference the coup explicitly, yet the demographic and economic transformation that followed the violence persists. The black commercial district erased between 1899 and 1905 was never restored to its prior density of ownership. Property lines once transferred under duress remain in contemporary deeds. Recognition did not reassign them. In 2006, when the Commission declared the event a coup, it implicitly invalidated the long-standing classification of riot that had shaped North Carolina education for decades. But that correction arrived after multiple generations had already been taught otherwise. The North Carolina education system had normalized the older term in textbooks approved throughout the 20th century. The Commission's action did not retroactively erase that influence. It added a new layer to an established foundation. The legal consequence of the 2006 report was advisory, not punitive. No posthumous indictments were filed. No formal state apology included enforceable restitution. The recognition altered the moral ledger. It did not alter the material one. There is also the matter of memory outside official record. For families descended from those displaced in November 1898, the state's acknowledgement confirmed what had been preserved privately for generations. For others, it challenged an inherited civic narrative. The contradiction between public commemoration and historical record became explicit. The state had once described the event as a disturbance. It now described it as a constitutional rupture. Both descriptions cannot occupy the same moral space. The 2006 report further confirmed that the removal of Wilmington's multiracial government was intentional and coordinated. That acknowledgement shifted interpretive responsibility back onto named actors. It did not erase their civic memorialization. Alfred Moore Waddell's name remains on buildings and in biographies that predate the Commission's findings. The legacy did not disappear. It was complicated. In 2007, following the Commission's report, the North Carolina General Assembly issued a formal expression of regret. Regret is a political instrument. It recognizes harm without imposing structural correction. The action of power in that statement was linguistic. It declared sorrow. It did not declare liability. The result is a layered legacy. Official documents now state that a coup occurred on November 10, 1898. Public school curricula in North Carolina have been revised to reflect that classification, yet the broader national understanding remains uneven. Federal acknowledgement never occurred in the period between 1898 and 1901, and no federal commission revisited that silence after 2006. The precedent of impunity established in the congressional climate of the late 19th century was not formally overturned. What remains is the visible paradox of recognition without redistribution. The state has declared the truth in writing. It has corrected the record. But the descendants of those removed, politically and economically, did not see proportional restitution. The injustice that began with the destruction of the Daily Record press and the forced resignation of elected officials on November 10, 1898, now occupies two official categories: first riot, then coup. The shift is real. It came with documentation, archival citation, and legislative acknowledgement. But it arrived after the beneficiaries of the 1899 consolidation of power had already secured generational advantage. The legacy that remained is not solely linguistic. It is spatial, it is demographic, it is institutional, it is embedded in municipal charters, property registries, and long-standing political alignments. And so the record closes not with denial, but with delayed recognition. Bound in a 2006 State Commission report, its pages cataloguing an injustice that had been written down in 1898 and reclassified more than a century later, resting on a shelf where truth now exists, but consequence remains unfinished. The 2006 reclassification did more than adjust a term in a state archive. It exposed the structural continuity between 1898 and the present civic landscape. When the Wilmington Race Riot Commission formally declared the events of November 10, 1898 a coup d'etat, it forced a recalibration not only of memory, but of institutional legitimacy. Yet what followed demonstrated how recognition can coexist with permanence. In 2008, curriculum standards within the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction were revised to incorporate the Commission's findings. The action was administrative and procedural, textbook language was updated, teacher training materials were amended, and the terminology coup began to replace race riot in formal lesson frameworks. That act of revision altered how future students would interpret the past. The consequence was generational awareness. But awareness does not reconstitute what was dismantled. What remained intact were the political and economic alignments that stabilized after 1899. By the time the state acknowledged the overthrow as insurrection, the constitutional amendment of 1900, instituting literacy tests and poll taxes, had long shaped the demographic composition of electoral participation. The reclassification in 2006 did not rescind those historical restrictions retroactively. It did not reopen electoral rolls erased in the early 20th century. The institutional damage had already crystallized into precedent. There is also the matter of municipal continuity. Wilmington City Hall, the same entity that recorded the forced resignations between November 10th and November 12th, 1898, still operates within a legal lineage uninterrupted by judicial reversal. No court nullified the administrative substitutions executed under threat. The Commission confirmed the illegitimacy of the removal. It did not invalidate the chain of authority that followed. The result is a paradox embedded in governance itself. A city whose official leadership lineage includes an acknowledged coup as a functional transition. In the years after 2006, public memorials were installed, plaques erected, and commemorative events formalized. These acts were visible and symbolic. They acknowledged absence. They did not restore presence. The black commercial district that once defined a portion of Wilmington's economic center was not reconstructed through state initiative. Property parcels transferred or abandoned between 1899 and 1905 remained within their subsequent ownership trajectories. Recognition did not trigger reversal of deed histories recorded in county registries. The Wilmington Race Riot Commission's report also influenced academic discourse nationwide. Universities integrated the case into broader studies of Reconstruction's aftermath and early Jim Crow consolidation. The terminology shift reframed the event within national scholarship. The consequence was intellectual correction. Yet the federal record, specifically the absence of intervention from the U.S. Congress between 1898 and 1901, remained unchanged. No retroactive federal inquiry re-examined that silence. The precedent of non-intervention, once set, was neither litigated nor formally repudiated. Another enduring element is civic honor. Streets, institutions, and historical markers associated with Alfred Moore Waddell were not uniformly renamed following the 2006 findings. Some local debates emerged. Some names persisted. The action of power here was selective inertia, the choice not to alter commemorative designations. The consequence was coexistence between acknowledgement of wrongdoing and continued symbolic recognition of its architect. The Commission's recognition also intersected with broader conversations about reparative justice. Recommendations for economic investment in historically marginalized communities were proposed. Implementation varied. Without binding legislative mandates, these recommendations functioned as guidance rather than obligation. The structural beneficiaries of the 1899 consolidation retained their inherited positional advantages. The state's acknowledgement did not impose redistributive correction. In contemporary Wilmington, public ceremonies now reference November 10, 1898, as an insurrection. Official websites describe the removal of the elected multiracial government. The narrative correction is visible. Yet demographic disparities rooted in the early 20th century remain statistically measurable. Economic concentration, property valuation gaps, and political representation patterns trace lineage back to the moment when representation was forcibly terminated. The injustice is not merely historical, it is cumulative. The Commission's work concluded in 2006, but its implications extend beyond the report's final page. It demonstrated that archival language can be altered. It proved that a state can admit institutional wrongdoing. It did not demonstrate that acknowledgement alone dissolves structural inheritance. The legacy that remained is therefore dual. On paper, the event is now accurately classified. In material reality, the systems fortified by the coup operated long enough to shape generations. Recognition arrived after consolidation had matured into norm, and so the record stands in two columns, one documenting a violent overthrow in November 1898, the other documenting its official recognition in December 2006. Between them lies a century in which silence functioned as policy. The correction exists, the continuity remains. The question that endures is not whether the coup occurred, that is now written clearly. The unresolved tension is whether acknowledgement without structural recalibration satisfies justice, or simply closes the archive while leaving the architecture untouched. The record has now been amended, but the structure remains. In 1898, a government was removed without formal war, without foreign invasion, without constitutional collapse. It was displaced through language, through declaration, through the quiet authority of men who understood that power rarely needs spectacle when it controls the narrative. By the time the violence subsided, the terminology had already begun its work. Restoration, order, riot. Words positioned carefully enough can outlast gunfire. American democratic institutions did not shatter that November morning. They absorbed the shock. They adjusted their phrasing. They allowed a substitution to be recorded as succession, and once entered into the ledger, repetition did the rest. Durable power does not rely solely on force. It depends on classification, on which documents are indexed, on which testimonies are archived, on which names are elevated and which are footnoted. The architecture of governance can survive almost any rupture if its custodians retain control over description. The removal of an elected government in Wilmington proved that democracy can be dismantled locally while the broader structure remains intact, provided the language softens the event into something administrative. The official memory, for decades, protected reputations before it protected victims. It preserved institutional continuity before it acknowledged rupture. And when acknowledgement finally arrived in 2006, it corrected the record without reversing the lineage of authority that followed the coup. The halls were renamed. The foundations were not rebuilt. Across the United States, similar corridors still stand, courthouses, city chambers, legislative floors, constructed in eras when exclusion was policy and documentation was strategy. The lesson of 1898 is not confined to Wilmington. It lingers wherever terminology shields power from scrutiny, wherever the absence of federal intervention becomes precedent, wherever silence matures into routine. The story does not end with recognition. Recognition is an entry in the archive. It is not restitution. It is not structural undoing. It is simply the moment when a sealed file is placed under brighter light. Within beyond the golden halls, we return to these corridors not to dramatize them, but to examine how authority endures, how decisions made in private rooms echo through public decades. If you choose to remain within these halls, do so with patience. The next sealed door does not open loudly. It yields slowly when attention is sustained. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten chambers are worth reopening. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows of institutional memory, ensure you are here when the next sealed door finally opens. The investigation does not conclude, it extends. Some archives are catalogued, others are contained, and some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.